Welcome everyone, and thanks so much for being here today. I'm Dr. Giedre Kligyte, and I'm a senior lecturer in the Transdisciplinary School at the University of Technology, Sydney. So I'll be moderating today's session on behalf of ITD Alliance Oceania Regional Network. So before we get started, I would like to also take a moment to acknowledge that we're all joining from different places across Oceania, and that much of our transdisciplinary work takes place on colonized lands. And I would really like to acknowledge Gadigal and Bidjigal land from which I'm dialing in today. And you're welcome to put in the name of the land that you're calling or joining us from today in the Zoom chat as well. And I think it's really important to think about what it means to be working from Aboriginal lands in Australia when we are engaging in transdisciplinary ways and leading transdisciplinary initiatives. And it comes with real responsibilities. It involves respecting Indigenous knowledges and protocols. It comes with recognizing the Indigenous sovereignty and also just being mindful of ongoing impacts of colonization. And I'm expecting that these issues will also surface as part of our conversation today. So today's session is called Lessons Learned from Leading Transdisciplinary Centers and Programs. And as many of you will know from experience, there's nothing simple about transdisciplinary initiatives, let alone leading them. So it involves a lot of complex ways of working and across disciplines, across different hierarchies, building relationships with a whole range of different people and decision makers, and engaging seriously with different and maybe sometimes even conflicting ways of knowing and expectations. So we're very lucky to have two very experienced leaders with us today. We have Peat Leith, who is the outgoing director of the Valuing Sustainability Future Science platform at CSIRO, and Lorrae van Kerkhoff, director of the ANU Institute for Water Futures at the Australian National University. So just a quick note on how the session will work. So Pete and Lorrae will each share 5 lessons from their experience, or however many you have. And after that, you'll have a conversation with each other, and then we'll open up the session for questions and comments from the audience. So this first part will be a formal part of the webinar, and we're recording it. And after that, we'll move to a Talanoa, which will be a more informal, open conversation for those who are able to stay on and potentially connect with each other in a more flowing conversational format. So with that, I'm just super happy to actually, we didn't discuss who is going to go first. So we'll get Pete to to start. Thank you. Pete, over to you then.
Thanks so much, and it's such a pleasure to be here. I'll start sharing my slides, which will just take me a moment to make sure it's all set up properly. And there you should have it. Thumbs up. Yes. Excellent. So I am doing a little bit of the setup for this because Lorrae and I had a fabulous lunch last week, which was a long overdue catch up, and discussed what we wanted to talk about. So hopefully we'll actually talk about some of the lessons which we have in common but are not the same separately. I'm really keen to dive right in. I just want to acknowledge there's a few people on the call who've been involved in the Valuing Sustainability FSP, and these reflections are partly coming out of work that we're doing, which is looking at our evaluation data across the program. But mostly they're really my own personal lessons from leading this program for the last 5 years. I'll kick off just by providing an overview, but I just wanted to do something else first, which is Lorrae and I had a conversation last week, and we talked about what we wanted to discuss. And there's a huge number of challenges in transdisciplinary research, as we all know, a lot of barriers, constraints, roadblocks. These are really not what we want to focus on. So we want to focus on how to make it work, but it really needs to be acknowledged that a lot of that making it work business for leadership involves engaging deeply with those challenges. So I just wanted to quickly do a little depiction of the way if we're sort of thinking about this, the way we discuss this, and this is part of the way we're framing it in the paper that we're working on at the moment from the Value Sustainability Program, that there's a huge meshwork of stacked drivers and interactions. And the bit that we have often control over to some degree is the program and team and individual level. And really how we enhance and buttress that capability in transdisciplinarity is such an important focus for our leadership in the face of, countervailing interests, investments, commitments, and discourses and narratives in the innovation system and more broadly that tend to be narrow in focus, focused on specific portfolios or disciplines, etc. So there's a huge amount of literature on this, but I think it's worth acknowledging that that's the sort of environment that we're working in and the focus that we wanted to sort of frame today around. The program that I've been leading for the last 5 years is called the Valuing Sustainability Future Science Platform, and I'm really happy to engage with folks about some of the outcomes and outputs of this work. But it was an investment in transdisciplinary sustainability science by CSIRO itself, and really focused on developing systemic approaches to catalysing multiple outcomes into the sustainability space simultaneously. So obviously around complex and contested problems where this sort of approach is necessary and sometimes sufficient. The future science platforms at CSIRO are a bunch of investments which have culminated now, but there were 22 different future science platforms over about a 10-year period. And most of them focused on sort of techno-scientific areas, Horizon 3 research to develop new capability within the organisation, but critically to build and empower new industries. So most of these were really focused on technical aspects, but some of them, like collaborative intelligence, value sustainability, responsible innovation, were broader capabilities that we need to build within the system or that we considered needed to be built. And the value sustainability piece was really driven by this awareness that there's an increasing demand for sustainability indicators, and there's all sorts of indicators associated with this, and potential to develop a whole heap of work in that area that drives sustainability outcomes if it's done well. And that's the critical point here, that there's no point in developing these indicators in isolation of the surrounding policy and industry environment. So really recognising that this transdisciplinary capability is necessary to move beyond looking simply at emissions reduction and incorporating that, for example, with future Made in Australia bills, industrial innovation and nature-based solutions. And this sort of thing is increasingly recognised. So that little picture down the bottom is from the National Science Statement, which just recognised the interaction of these many different disciplines necessary to embed within a broader decision-making context. So how do we do it? We essentially tried to link our system science capability with innovation for sustainability, which is really about coordinating social, technological, policy innovation in this space, and to do that through co-production processes that really empower and enable different voices, but also address these issues like equity, justice, and inclusion in the processes of our work, to develop measures that matter that are really legitimate and relevant to different stakeholders across supply chains and policy, etc. So it's a big ambition, right? Of course, this is what we often do. We frame things in these huge terms, but when it comes down to it, we have to do specific projects. And these are the 7 projects that we ended up working on. The program itself was an $18 million investment. We recruited 16 early career researchers and had about 55 people from CSIRO involved in those projects on a very non-full-time basis. So a lot of the work was done by our amazing ECRs who led these project activities. But you can see here that there's a whole variety of things, from social and ecological tipping points to just sustainability transitions, which was focused on critical minerals and agri-food, to really big picture questions around directionality in the innovation system and how we drive some of that sort of work and social co-benefits of ESG reporting. So there was lots of it that was focused on particular indicators, and some of it that was focused on capabilities within the system more broadly, but within a specific context. So that's my overview of where I'm coming from, and that the bits that I now want to talk about are my lessons from this. And I really like to. It's really hard to pick 5 things to talk about from a program like this, but I guess in picking these 5, oops, hang on, I rolled forward too fast. I don't know how that happened. The key to me is, how would I answer these questions now? And they're probably quite different from how I would have at the beginning of this program. And one of the key things for me was how to focus effectively, how to help support teams to focus effectively. And I think one of the critical things that as leaders we need to do is to empower and enable processes for scoping, scaling, and collectively framing problems and project contributions to outcomes. And this is really quite tricky when you're dealing with big problem spaces and many diverse stakeholders who have different interests, and how you align and build a collective that's able to learn within that in a very specific space, that you can actually do what you've set out to do within the short, in our case, 3-year time period of a postdoc. And so we set up a variety of processes to try and help support that. And some of them were around theories of change early on in the project, developing theories of change and thinking through that sort of stuff, which I'll talk about a bit more later. But also really about understanding what the different capabilities of the team are and how that can be applied to the specific problem, and what the networks and relationships that exist are and how they can be leveraged. So there's a few things in there. But I'll skip on to the next because I don't have a lot of time to talk about this. I thought this was a nice way of framing it, because rabbit holes, we go down them all the time, and they're often considered a bad thing. But, Alice was transformed by going down the rabbit hole, right? And we often are transformed. But if we can go down rabbit holes successfully together, but they can also burn us badly. And I think this idea that you can curate the right sort of rabbit holes for effective collaborative learning and extend that beyond your research team to a broader collective, but not enough to frustrate and deter engagement. There's a real interesting balance there, and I think it's always different for different settings. I don't know, this is moving on automatically, so I know what's happening here, but it's obviously telling me that I need to move on. What collectives to build? I really love the work of Innes and Bohr in this space, which just sort of says that you've got to have a diversity of agents and interdependence of agents to drive authentic dialogue. It's really annoying. And that authentic dialogue is integral to the collectives that we create with external stakeholders and partners. So how we figure through those diversity of interest and interdependence to make sure everyone has skin in the game and can build this shared purpose and reciprocity is a really critical component. Which capabilities to strengthen? This is always going to be context dependent. And I think teams and individuals will have such a diversity. We often have these deep commitments to our own methods and disciplines. And one of the key capabilities, obviously, in transdisciplinary work is this ability to understand across the differences and to be able to really interrogate and listen. And one of our real challenges in this program, I think, was to build those bridges, but also to have a critical dialogue across disciplines and with stakeholders about what we need to do. So I think that's one of the critical pieces. How to think about change. So I said early on that we embedded a theory of change process in the work that we did in our projects. And that was really useful and really set up proactively to get people thinking about how they see change and what sort of change processes work in what contexts. the piece around being proactive is, I think, critical for leaders to actually implement and instigate early project thinking about what the theory of change is and whose theories come to bear on it and how that discussion is opened up. But also to be reflexive about that, knowing that we as leaders don't necessarily have the answer, but we can provide scaffolding, good theory, and some ideas around practice. And we did this in the FSP to some good effect. And I think people really appreciated that early stage learning about what the system was that they're embedded in and different ways of thinking about that system and how it might change. I think I'm within time, and I'll wrap up there and pass to Lorrae.
Thanks, Pete. Now my turn to do the screen sharing. Get that ready. I hope everyone can see that okay. Yep, awesome. Yeah, thanks. It was certainly a very inspiring conversation that we had last week to share both our similarities and the different perspectives that we brought to our own experiences of attempting. Leadership sounds like an ambitious word to me. Attempting to shepherd these complex entities to do good work and to create really insightful new understandings of complex issues, but also to be able to transform them into actionable kinds of outputs. As you can see here, so I'm speaking from with the hat of Director of Institute for Water Futures, which is an entity at the Australian National University that, a bit like Pete, was internally funded, or still is internally funded as a strategic investment by the university itself. And our rationale, or our purpose, is really to help people to understand change and to enable action. You can see our little slogan there, and I'll speak a little bit more about the Institute in just a moment. I'd like to add my own acknowledgement of country. Thanks, Giedre, for really introducing your own acknowledgement and such. Engaging with First Nations has been a really important part of the work that we've been doing at the Institute for Water Futures. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra. And this beautiful photo is of one of our cultural residents. One of the programs that we've been running over the past 6 years has been to appoint cultural residents, and it's a little bit like an artist in residence, but the point of it really is to bring people to the ANU and have a mutual learning experience while supporting our cultural resident to create something that is meaningful to them. We can share in that journey. This photo is of Hosea's Clare from the Fitzroy River area, Marawara, up near Broome. So just a little bit of background about the Institute for Water Futures, just so that you've got some context for the scale and what we're talking about as Pete introduced for his program. As I said, the Institute has this a slogan, I guess you could say, of understanding change and enabling action, but really trying to build more holistic understandings of complex water challenges. We deal with freshwater, and primarily non-urban systems, so agricultural systems and unmanaged systems as well. And building that out, we really want to enable and support ideas around having a sustainable and just water future for everyone, empowered through collaboration, innovation, integrity, and influence. We have 12 researchers. I mean, it's a bit of a fuzzy number because people are coming and going. Some people are part-time and working with IWF. But roughly 12 full-time equivalent researchers. We have a core budget of around $1.5 million per annum from the university. And there are some stats there on the screen that will give you a bit of a snapshot of the sort of outputs and scale that we're talking about. I really just wanted to put this up there to give you a sense of the scale. So we're not an enormous program, but we're still a significant investment on behalf of the university to tackle the complex issues around water, predominantly within Australia, but also to some extent internationally. Over the years, our vision, I guess, has evolved as well. If any of you are familiar with water research, I'm sure some of you are, you'll know that it's quite a well-populated space within Australia. And we're really focusing as we sort of mature as an organisation, as an entity, on the futures component. So a lot of things that are labelled something futures, Pete's talking about the future science platforms, etc. We really take the futures and futuring methods and methodologies as core to our business. So most of what we do in terms of research and implementation are based on the application of some kind of futuring to the work that we do, to the understanding and actions that we're supporting. So on to my lessons. I guess, one observation that I bring, sort of reflecting again on the leadership position is perspective, is that as individuals, you've heard Pete's story and certainly my story. We come at this from our own values, from our own priorities, from the things that we feel are most important. And you'll probably see sort of through the talk that I'll just follow through for the next 8 minutes or so. I'm very much focused on people and processes. So it's very tempting to get caught up in what are the outputs, what's the transformation, what's the change, and Pete highlighted that in his last slide. But for me, when reflecting on what I wanted to bring to this presentation about leadership, very much for me, it's about people and processes, and I'll talk through a bit more what that means. So first of all, my first point when I was thinking about the lessons, taking on board, as Pete indicated, that all of the institutional barriers and challenges and administration and all of those things that I'm sure many of you have firsthand experience of and probably know very well, they're all in the frame as well. They are all present. They're things that we grapple with on a day-to-day basis. But I didn't want to focus on those. I wanted to think about what are the key things that I think perhaps we've done more successfully or are sort of good to reflect on. And the first one is recruiting the right people. When we were initially funded, we were funded on the 1st of January 2020, and I'm sure you can take a moment to think about how terrible a time that is to be funded to start a collaborative, outward-facing kind of entity like the Institute for Water Futures. But we did do some recruitment in 2019 and throughout 2020, and in fact right through the time that we've been operating. And our emphasis is really on recruiting the right people and thinking about what that means. And it's often, of course, not the standard academic indicators that we were looking for. We've had many applicants for the positions that we were offering. These were continuing appointments, so they were quite desirable and very highly contested. We really wanted people who could demonstrate in multiple ways how they are interested in working across disciplines from an academic and intellectual point of view, but also genuinely interested in collaborating with other people. And I think that's something that we have managed by and large with, there's always a couple of exceptions, but I think we've managed that really well. We've had an incredible team of mostly early career academic researchers coming through, and they very quickly formed an amazing connection with each other and lots of terrific ideas bubbling up to the surface. So thinking about what are the not only the capabilities in terms of the skills and the knowledge that they bring, but also, what's the human side of this? What are the features that we're looking for, the characteristics that we're looking for in people to make that mean that they will be good team players? One of the things that came about, though, given that we had recruited this wonderful team of people who are genuinely interested in inter or transdisciplinary work and had amazing sets of skills, lots of different experience. I guess, when I'm reflecting on particularly the first few years, which of course were very disrupted, but the first few years of our institute, I guess perhaps naively, I thought, well, we'll just put all these people into a room together and we'll give them plenty of time to get to know each other, and good projects and ideas and things will come out of that. Certainly ideas did. But what I found was that on the one hand, we had these amazing, incredible young researchers who were very dynamic. They were really collaborative, etc. We had all of those people in the room. But at the same time, we had all these people who had all these wonderful projects that were already going. They had their own networks, they had their own connections, they were incredibly busy. They had full programs of research and activity that they were bringing into the Institute. And also that set them on very on quite attractive and really positive pathways. You know, when you've got a good reputation in a certain area and you've got collaborators you like working with, you tend to continue to collaborate with them rather than with the person who's sitting next door to you that I would like them to collaborate. So we really over time had to start to incentivize that collaboration amongst our team. So they were collaborating with all kinds of people outside of the Institute, but to try to really build on that transdisciplinary capability that we had, we really needed to provide ways for them to really step out of their trajectories that they were currently on and to rethink and to establish some new ways of working with groups that they perhaps wouldn't have worked with otherwise. And to do that, they had to give up something else. And I think that was the big recognition for me, is that it's not just about adding more things on, it's about helping people to give up something that they are engaged in and passionate about, to try to develop something else. And that wasn't as easy as I was imagining it might be. The third lesson is about maintaining theoretical and methodological engagement. And this lovely photo is of Stephanie Rosestone, a PhD student who I think is really developing some really interesting methodological and theoretical sort of concepts about how people think about the future. She's created the Museum of Future Water, as you can see here, which is now a travelling exhibition that she takes to different events and is now in quite high demand around the place, as a way of opening up conversations around water. But to think about that from a methodological and a transdisciplinary methodological point of view, and really maintaining that academic and intellectual interest, and is not only about rigor, but it's also about the curiosity and maintaining that kind of academic dimension to what we do. Because it is very easy, I think, when you're working on applied issues and complex ones, to sort of get dragged into a mode that's a bit more like a consultancy or a bit more like applied research. Whereas, we do need to keep the discourse that the work that we're doing is also really at the cutting edge of transdisciplinary methods and theory. The fourth one, now this is a bit more sort of coming back again to the leadership component, is to think about, well, how do we craft our outward image or presentation to the world? And of course, for us, we need to do that both to the university to convince them to continue to fund us, but also to our external partners. And this is really, over time, we're thinking about, I've been reflecting on how we build a shared identity and shared agendas, and to do that quite strategically. So again, coming back to what I was saying before, we have people who are interested, ready, willing to be working together, but finding the right pathways and activities to do that often meant sort of taking smaller chunks of that, or smaller bites of that process, and building it up strategically over time. So we've always done our strategic planning. We have annual retreats, all of those standard kinds of things, and we've always done them very collaboratively and with genuine input and engagement from our whole team. But then we're gradually building that up then into larger programs of work. And I've flagged here the Futures Masterclass, which we're running our inaugural one in July. And that's our first effort to really construct an activity where everybody from the Institute is going to play a role in that. And we're doing that not only because we want to create a really exciting product to offer to the market, but also the executive education market, but also to enable us to continue to build that conversation, that shared identity, that way of relating to each other. So that's been a really exciting initiative, and sort of represents the next step on this kind of journey of building our own collaborative capacity and capability. And the last one I wanted to that I've been reflecting on is really about how we narrate our impact, the impact we have here. I'm thinking about it out in the world. And Pete mentioned that, we often, and our institute was no different, we often begin with very big claims about what it is that we're going to be doing, what we're going to achieve, what complex problems and challenges we're going to be solving. You've seen that in our vision, safe and just water futures for everybody, not short on ambition. But in the context of that, then we do need to think about, well, how do we talk about the impact that we are having in the world? How do we evidence that? But also, how do we kind of put boundaries around it so that we can still speak to the broader vision, but also at the same time have realistic expectations about what we may or may not be achieving. And as I've said here on the slides, the external justification or the perception from outside of the value of transdisciplinary work is often viewed through this lens of impact. It's like, yes, you're engaging with complex water problems, so you're going to be solving them, and so in 5 years' time, we should be seeing how that's happening. So I think part of the leadership role is actually to think very carefully about how we narrate what our impact is. Potentially sometimes perhaps also to narrate what it isn't, and be quite considered about how we engage with some of these bigger narratives that go around impact, or, we're now hearing a lot of language around missions, for example, how the research enterprise is going to reorganize itself to be more applied and more valuable for public issues and challenges. So that is something that we need to be quite careful about and manage that narrative of the organisation, so that we're not over-promising, but at the same time not also underselling the contributions that we're making, and that's something that takes care. I think I can leave it at that, Giedre. That was my last slide, so I will stop sharing and look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the beautiful insights and just the complexity of the work that you're doing with so much creativity and truly inspirational work. So the next 10 minutes or so, we will invite both of you to engage in conversation with each other. So I wonder if Pete or Lorrae, if anything perhaps resonated with you or stood out for you, or if you have a burning question about anything.
I love talking about this with you, Lorrae, and I really thought your insights around this sort of, well, there's two bits that all these bits are connected, right? But the piece that people have sort of set pathways, and that in some ways you can leverage the resources we have to give them chances to do different things, do things differently. One of the things we found, two of our projects worked really closely with Indigenous groups. One of them around critical minerals and justice around critical minerals development, and the other one around data sovereignty and issues around data justice. And both did a fabulous job, but they were really coming from those traditions of working across epistemologies, across knowledge systems. And then there were a bunch of particularly early career researchers who were really interested in this, but it was a huge leap and really challenging, and really took a lot of emotional toll for some of them when they tried to do that work. I just wondered if you could reflect on that thing of where you leverage the resources to enable people to step into spaces, and how you create safety in that, because it's a really people have big ambitions in this space often, and there's often very challenging steps to take into some of these thorny issues and contested spaces.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, Pete, and I think it's an ongoing issue, and there's certainly no well, every case is different, right? So there's never going to be a single solution. But when it comes back to what we were talking about when I was saying you're building those incentivizing people to come together and to do new and interesting things. I mean, the mechanics of it were quite simple. We had some operational funding that we allocated for seed funds, and then people were able to apply for seed funding over a certain period, and it had to involve more than one person from the institute, more than one staff member from the institute. So they had to be working together. They had to have some sort of idea, and it could leverage their previous networks and so forth, and go forth and do good things. And that was really only partly successful. I mean, it served its purpose at that fairly superficial level. It got people working together a little bit more, but they were still largely, side projects and things that people couldn't really invest a lot of time in because we weren't offering a lot of money. But the other thing that's emerged then that's quite interesting, and the learning that we've taken from that then is we've reorientated that program and funding, which we're still running. But as of last year, we've said, okay, we actually want you to focus not on a project, but on a partnership. So how are you going to take, we've got seed funding here, we can support travel, we can support other kinds of engagement, but we don't, and we're not particularly interested in and it comes back to the people and process, what the outcomes are. We want you to invest in a partnership with an external partner, and just to sort of take that forward and just see where it leads. And that, I think, is kind of is a little bit helpful, because then people can invest in, because we know, particularly coming back to First Nations relationships, it takes time, it takes effort. You have to get beaten up a couple of times before you really understand what the mindset and the thinking is that you need to bring into this very beautiful but also very challenging epistemological space. And so it kind of it helps to create that the resources and the incentive and the motivation and the space for people to engage in those more difficult relationships in building relationships in ways that can be challenging, because you don't have the pressure of, oh, but at the end we've got to write this report, or we've got to come up with this publication or something like that. So I don't know that it's not going to be a solution that fits everybody, and it's not going to be, available to everyone as well. But it was certainly, an evolution in the way that we approach this, to kind of step back from the idea of these relationships, particularly with external partners, having to be outcome or output oriented, to actually just being more about, not just, to being more about building relationships, building trust, building understanding first before we move into anything further.
That's so amazing.
Can I just
Pete, as well, I also would like to follow Lorrae to ask a question of you as well, if that's possible. I think we can follow up on this super interesting idea of funding partnerships versus projects, which I think is a mental note for myself. But I wonder if you have any questions to Pete.
I do, of course I do, Pete. I mean, the one that because this is a question that we didn't really get to talk through last week, because it's something that I've reflected on as I was pulling the slides together and thinking about the session today. And one of my opening comments, I mentioned that, we come to this from, as leaders, we come to this with our own personal values and vision, and we see that through in the implementation. Pete, what do you think of the personal characteristics that you brought to the leadership of the FSP that you can see in the way that it unfolded, and had a positive effect on where it went?
So I'll answer that by reflecting on one of the things that you were just saying before, because I think it's a really interesting difference between a centre that's long-lived and a program that's short-lived. And one of the things that I tried to do and had a commitment to was the people who we were, working, who were in the program, and particularly our early career researchers. Mm. But there was a huge challenge there, because they had this short time to do what a postdoc has to do, which is largely about publication, right? I mean, in the system that we live in. I think we were able, especially in the early part of the FSP's life, to create a space of real inquiry and relationship building. And I think as time went on, that I think I tried probably to push it too hard, but I pushed it quite hard intentionally because I wanted people to come out with a different postdoc experience, right? Um, and it was there's people who are involved in the FSP on this call, so they may disagree with me, but there was quite a bit of pushback saying we don't have time for all of this stuff. We don't have time to dive into the sort of stuff that you're requesting of us. But there's an odd thing in this that I think the people who did the most and best of that really came out with a richer experience and as you know, more rounded researchers, if you want. And it didn't necessarily affect their public. I mean, it's all individual, right? But some of the people who did it really a lot got great publication records because they managed to engage with and dig into other people's thinking and support their writing and etc. So there are pathways there, and I think that the challenge of cracking them open for people is always going to be very contextual and individual. But I think one of the things of really being insistent on this space for collaboration and for interaction and relationship building was one of the things that I really valued as like process over output, as yeah, you sort of put it. But it's hard to do when you're in this time-constrained programmatic environment.
Mm.
Amazing reflections, and I think just so interesting to see the different ways you're breaking these institutional formats and structures to kind of find those spaces to do something different and collaborate differently. I wonder if anybody in the audience have any comments or questions, or if anything, any sparks for you, Peter?
Hi, Lorrae and Pete, thanks so much for the really thought-provoking presentations. I've done a bit of thinking about this in a few contexts, and I'm interested in the models that underpin it. And this is going to sound like a question about money, but it's actually more about framing. So most universities, including my own, have small $10,000, $15,000 seed funding, get together with another discipline. And I guess if I was being cynical about that, I would say it's throwing a lot of things and seeing maybe a few will stick. You seem to both have benefited from a more substantial institutional commitment, but I'm wondering if the expectation is that you become self-sustaining. I noticed you've raised a lot of money, Lorrae, but you still seem to have a base funding. So how important is the upfront substantial commitment, and how important is the ongoing, whether it's financial or the ongoing commitment to supporting your time?
Yeah, good question. I'm happy to have a go at this first, and then Pete, you can talk about the FSP, which is obviously a different model. I mean, when we were funded, our institute really was in a very privileged position. We were funded, as I said, funding was announced in 2019, pre-COVID. So university was relatively well off. You know, we weren't, hadn't yet experienced the crunch that we all know has happened from 2020 onwards and is still ongoing. There were a couple of things. So I guess as a bit of context, there were a couple of strategic moves that were made right at the beginning when we were applying for funding. This was funding that was allocated under the National Institutes grant, which is part of the funding that comes to the university, and was, from the university's point of view, a device for them to be able to kind of point to the application of the National Institutes grant and show that it's doing good things in the world. Most of the grant is just dispersed across the university. So it fit within that kind of narrative or that intention at the time that it was funded. What we did, and this was in collaboration, this was very much a we approach, because I actually came into the application process a little bit later than the initial vision, was to base the application on the creation of, at the time it was 10, it's now 7 continuing appointments. And the continuing appointments were absolutely critical. And I very much doubt, Peter, that if we had not had continuing appointments, which were contracted with the university like any other tenured position, I don't know that we would still be here today. But because that was the basis, the contracts were held with the schools. I mean, this gets into some of the boring administrative stuff about how do you make these entities stick in institutions that are not designed for them. They were contracted with their schools like any other tenured position. Some were tenure track, but we were lucky to get them. We did manage to get them converted. So that baseline was there, which meant that even though our budget is $1.5 million, the actual budget over and above the salaries that are committed by the university is pretty small. It's about $400,000. And so in that sense, we are able to, we're kind of just justifying that extra top layer, if you know what I mean. So that was a part of it. It does also come back to linking to the impact narratives as well and how we do that. One of the things that's really significant about us and how we are placed in the university and how we try to make sure that this is still very much in people's minds. Our university has a strategic plan that's comprised of 3 pillars, no surprises: research excellence, education excellence, and social transformation, societal transformation. We fit in the 3rd pillar, and we're one of the few entities that really genuinely does. So we can sort of say to the university, we tick all of these boxes, which you are struggling, maybe not struggling might be too extreme a word, but really, very strong on the other 2. This one is a little bit patchy. We can help you to tick those boxes, and we're very careful that we position ourselves in that way. So it's kind of sort of taking that narrative back and saying, this is how you need to look at us. Not necessarily through the lens of return on investment, although that always kind of raises its head, but through the lens of what is this university about, and this is how we're trying to help you to do that.
Gabrielle, and also Peat maybe wanted to respond. Is that a different question, Gabrielle, or?
It's a different question.
Okay, so Peat, do you want to respond as well?
Yeah, I will briefly. The Future Science Platform model is an interesting one, and it's much more based around a sort of organizational company investment scheme. So it's Horizon 3 research, and most of it is oriented towards commercialization pathways. So very much going, we're going to take a risky investment up front in hope that some of these investments pay off and we develop Wi-Fi, for example, right? These are the sorts of things that you want to build through a future science platform. But this is a very different proposition, right? So we had a big and a hard time making the proposition that we need to build a capability in the organisation to be ready for a sustainability era, which unfortunately doesn't seem to be arriving at any great speed, where there is markets for nature-based solutions, where there's all these other emerging markets that require specific targeted scientific capability around the sorts of things that we were building, and that we are an early mover in that space, I guess, was the proposition. So I think CSIRO does occupy that space reasonably well, and has done so because we have such a broad range of people who we can mobilise and bring together to address particular problems. But the argument about building this muscle, this capability to do that really well and effectively and get better at it, I think was a hard one to make and a hard one to evidence that we've really done it in terms of both process and outcome. It's a really difficult thing to build the case around, but we've tried to do that throughout, and its success will be measured in years and decades to come, I suspect.
Yeah, it's a tricky space. Thanks both. Gabrielle?
So this is a question you're not going to want to answer for yourself. So I'm going to get Peat to answer it for Lorrae and Lorrae to answer it for Peat. So Peat, what do you think the 5 things are that Lorrae brings to leadership that are really outstanding? And Lorrae, what do you think the 5 things are that Peat brings to leadership that are really outstanding?
Well, so it's a hard question to answer because I've never worked directly with Lorrae. We know each other through many meetings and social interactions, but also because I do know a few people she works with very well. And I think one of the things that I've heard and I've seen in Lorrae, I don't know if I'm going to get to 5 here, but a gentleness and compassion with others that she actually lives herself, that she doesn't push onto other people a way of doing things or my way or the highway. Or completely the contrary. She believes people need to have rich and full lives that are paced in their own way according to their own capabilities and needs and circumstances. And I think that builds an enormous trust in leadership that is rare, frankly, because it's honest and it's authentic in the way she works. I might do one more because that was a pretty big one, and I'm conscious of time. I think the other thing that Lorrae brings is a huge methodological and theoretical understanding. So we both come from a similar space in science and technology studies to sort of theoretical understanding, which means we have a common language and ground to work from. I think that's incredibly useful and rich in this transdisciplinary space, because understanding the nuance of co-production, not just as a process, but as a way of thinking about the way knowledge and worlds are produced, brings this depth that sort of is a foundation for a group's discussion and continues to deepen it and strengthen it. And I think that's a really big. So I think those 2 huge things, and I'll count them as my 5.
Thanks, Pete. I think I could kind of, reflect them right back to you as well, and sort of take that as a couple of mine. But I do think the things that I see in Pete and the way that you approach this is also, the first thing that kind of sings out is that care for people and the understanding the humanness that underpins all of this, and to recognize, I really appreciate what you were saying about your early career academics, is to recognize that there are pressures that people are under that are their own and that we need to work with. And I think that's something that you do really well, is to know how to support people to flourish in an environment that frankly often isn't all that the greater environment is often not very friendly. And friendly might be sort of downplaying it, because yes, it is about care, it's about compassion, it's about creating a supportive environment, but I think also about that space where you can balance what people need for the bigger picture of their individual careers and trajectories alongside, pushing them into, it's like, you might not realize that you need this now, but I'm going to build it in anyway, because that I know that this is something that will be good in your career as you progress. And I think that's a really it's a really fine balance to get right. And I think, Pete, you've got real skill in doing that and doing that really well. The other thing that I'd highlight, which I think is interesting, and again, perhaps that real reflection on leadership, is understanding where you sit in the system, in the bigger system, the institutional system that you're a part of, and how to kind of work with that system at the same time as challenging it. And that's something I really admire in what you do, Pete. You really are able to build the case, and the language that you use around capability is really strong, and to use the language that will make sense to people who don't necessarily buy into the whole transdisciplinary sustainability science STS kind of world, but to really find those points of commonality and to build the case very strongly to say, CSIRO or Australia, you need this because this is what we're doing that's going to help. And I think that's such an important part of leadership in this space.
Thanks so much for these reflections. Sounds like you're both amazing leaders to be working for and with. I'm just mindful about the time, and I can see there's two questions that we will take next, but I also noticed that some people might have to leave. So we still have another half an hour for conversation. So there's no pressure. But if you need to leave, I just would like to remind you that this is an ITD Alliance Oceania regional network session, that we have a whole exciting and amazing program planned for the whole year. So the next session coming up will be in May, and we are going to have some amazing presenters talking about building partnerships in the Pacific region for the longer term. So basically just saying stay tuned and sign up for the newsletter and kind of watch this space in terms of joining for some more conversations like that. And if you need to leave, that's completely fine, but we still have another half an hour to continue the conversation. So let's just throw to Yeheis for his question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Hi, Yeheis.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Lorrae and Peat, for a wonderful reflection of the work that you've been doing. And I can attest that to Peat that I haven't been part of the work that he does directly, but I have been beneficiary of the FSP for other work that we're currently doing. Just a pointed question. Moving forward, having those lessons that you've learned, given that transdisciplinary research and approach to sustainability is critical, what are the things that you think in the future, if you were to take one thing that we need to change, needs to change for transdisciplinary research to contribute, particularly for sustainability transformations, what would that be?
Who's going to take that first? I'll go. I mean, the one word for me, well, one word, is really about futures. I do think, and Yeheis, you used the word about sustainability transformations. I think that we have really been slow and kind of underdeveloped intellectually and methodologically for thinking about how we engage with the future, how we use concepts of the future when we're talking about sustainability, because sustainability is inherently future oriented, right? It's about a more sustainable state to come. And I think that there's a lot of potential and value in really unpacking those future-oriented concepts like transformation, like adaptation, and all of that stuff. It's all got such a deeply future-oriented connotation that I think we don't spend enough time understanding, unpacking, and really thinking through. So part of a spruik for the Institute for Water Futures, of course, but there you go.
Thanks for the question, Yes. I'm going to build on Lorrae's piece there. I was listening to the Reith lectures on ABC, Rutger Bregman, and although I've got a lot of issues with the way he frames this stuff, I think the piece around creating inviting, exciting collectives which think about and build futures collectively. So how we build collectives which people just want to be part of is, to me, the game here. And there's so much disillusionment with our institutions, universities, government organisations. There's so much disenfranchisement of people who are struggling, and we've got we're in this incredible moment in history. And for me, anyway, transdisciplinarity offers this pathway to bring people together on. It's not relativistic, everyone in all knowledge is equal, but it is a theorized way of going, how do we do things together in ways that are really properly generative and lead to better outcomes, and doing that across whether you're working with policymakers or with folks in local communities or Indigenous groups. It's the same principle, right? You're creating a space where people can be really generative and get excited about futures that are shared and better. And I think that process evidences its own value. because one of the difficulties I think we have is getting wrapped up in this idea that we need to track our outcomes in a sort of utilitarian and linear way when we're dealing in a relational space, and the relationality itself provides the evidence for those who are involved. The problem is that you only have the small group, right? So that becomes the challenge of how do you build out from that? And I don't know the answer to that, but maybe AI.
That's one way to dampen the conversation. I think it's very obvious that you do both have that excitement and vision and inspiration in both of the centers that you lead. And so over to Michael, and after that, I think we can finish the formal session and chat informally.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Because I'm joining from like a weird site. I wasn't sure if. Anyway, so thank you so much for these presentations, and I felt like Lorrae's presentation and takeaway points that resonated very strongly with my own experience. So like I've just like love to see them like in a different institute, like playing out kind of very similarly. So there's one big difference with the place that I'm working in, which is it's called Tokyo College, and it's an institute for advanced studies that does like is focusing on interdisciplinarity. But we are HSS led, like humanities and social sciences led, not exclusively, but kind of the impetus is kind of coming from that side. And then the other thing is that we are pretty exploratory, so we don't have a pretty strong like push from the university or something that would be output oriented per se. So like individual scholars or postdocs and so on, they do their stuff and they do their publications, but we're very strong in that exploratory part and working together, have a strong culture. But I just like as one person in the leadership would be interested in, maybe pushing people a tiny bit more towards outcomes, also like shared publications or like other things. So I was, Lorrae, maybe you also have something like to say about that, but like Peat, you explicitly like talked in that first thing that you said, like the first of the 5 points, you talked about focusing, right? Like as a key skill that you need to have as a leader, but also like a key thing that the institute needs to be able to do, help people focus, not just narrow down, but also like focus towards shared goals and maybe also shared impact output and so on. So I just wondered if Peat, if you could just expand a bit on that part, like some strategies that in that sense or like concepts or whatever that work for you. And of course also, Lorrae, if you have anything on that point, I would also be very happy to hear. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Michael. This is probably a question of do as I say, not as I do, because I think it's one of the things that I didn't do as well as we could have in the Future Science platform. And part of the thing is we had a luxury of developing projects under our own steam. And some of those projects were very much sort of science led. So, they were they're supply driven, as it were. So the scientists were furthering their own research, which is fine, but they weren't necessarily doing it in and with a collective of external people. They had the relationships and they second guessed or whatever, like there was a sense that they knew what needed to be done to advance that area of research. Probably true, but I didn't really put this sort of very clear structure around forms of project opening, like idea opening up and closing down. So I really love the work of Andy Sterling in this space of like opening up and closing down and keeping things complex. And when you really thinking through when you do close down the discussion and how long you keep it open for. And I think there's a real art and probably a bit of a science in timing that well for different project activities or activities generally. But I think it requires, really thinking about what that stage of a project life is and who needs to be involved when. Like when you move out from the team's initial ideation to start seeking other people's engagement. And this goes for externally funded projects as well, right? You've got to develop ideas and then go out and then come back, and so all that process. There's a lot of practices in that space, but not a lot of it, I think, is that informed by a lot of the transdisciplinary theory. And if someone knows of this stuff, please send me stuff, because it's something I'm thinking about more, is how to more formalize or bring that into a sort of more structured way of working, I guess. It's hard to pin that down. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's an attempt.
The only thing I'd add to that, Michael, and I guess sort of from a more sort of pragmatic, logistical point of view, part of the reason that we've gone to our seed funding now being geared towards developing partnerships is that, we really want, I think that encounter between the researchers and decision makers, or whoever they might be, real world people, that encouraging that encounter and that conversation and that mutual learning to say, okay, I've got a bunch of kind of academic knowledge and understandings and really in-depth, ways of seeing particular problems. Let's talk to people who are encountering similar problems, but in very different ways in their professional context. So whether it's in government or non-government sector, private sector, and so on. Just bringing them together and letting them have that conversation can be really inspiring for them to start to see the application of their work in solving or tackling, addressing, progressing societal challenges and issues. So that relation, coming back to Pete's point about the relationality, that's expanding the researchers' domain of relationships is part of what we've been trying to do. We'll see how it goes.
Thank you so much to both of you.
Thanks so much. And talking about opening up and closing down, I think clearly I'm not very good at making those decisions on time, because we're a little bit over. But I think at this point we can just thank Peat and Lorrae for amazing insights and conversation. And I'll stop the recording and we can continue chatting, but more informally.